The beginning. February 14th, 1993, Valentine's Day. A chill hung in the air across the quiet suburb of Maplewood, Ohio. The streets were mostly deserted, dusted with leftovers of snow from last week's flurry, and the sky had that muted, leaden look that makes everything appear faded and silent. At the edge of town, wedged between the leafless woods and an old neglected railway line, 4 local kids roamed restlessly, their breaths fogging in the cold. They had gathered after lunch, bundled up in mismatched scarves and jackets, driven outdoors more by boredom than by inspiration. Soccer had become their default entertainment, and this makeshift field near the tracks, with its muddy patches and scraggly weeds, served as their impromptu stadium. Josh, the oldest at nearly 11, showed off with reckless kicks. Billy protested the unfair rule changes, Christine eyed the boys warily, and her little brother Zach, the most determined, was anxious to retrieve the new blue soccer ball every time it rocketed out of bounds. On this particular afternoon, a wild shot sent the ball bouncing through frostbitten grass and underbrush, rolling toward the whispering rails that sliced through Maplewood for decades. Zach darted after it. "Wait up!" his sister called, but he barely heard her. The others trailed behind, boots crunching over the icy debris, not expecting anything more than a muddy chase. But as Zach stooped to grab the ball, his small hands hesitated. Just beyond the edge of the tracks, half obscured beneath a heap of dead leaves and a discarded denim jacket, lay something uncanny. Something altogether out of place amid the familiar litter of cans and torn wrappers. 2 objects, one shaped with the unmistakable fragility of a doll or maybe an animal. "Looks like a cat," Billy guessed, squinting. Christine edged closer, her heart pounding, but even before she knelt, dread prickled at the back of her neck. The group fell silent as they clustered around. Josh, sudden boldness wavering, reached out to nudge aside the blue-gray jacket, trying to convince himself it was just another pile of junk. That illusion shattered instantly. What they uncovered was no toy, no animal. It was the partial body of a child, tiny and frail, pale skin mottled by the chill, curling up under the remnants of clothing. The sight was so abrupt and alien to their world of play that none of the 4 could fully process it, at least not at first. Then Zach, a tough kid most days, let out a thin, keening wail. Fear rose rapidly among them. Christine, fighting tears, grabbed Zach's arm and started backpedaling. Josh, trembling, tried to keep his composure but couldn't stop his teeth from chattering. The initial confusion gave way fast, raw terror and the urge to flee. The children scattered, all adrenaline, their soccer ball forgotten, footprints swallowed in the melting snow. Their voices echoed off the bare trees as they sprinted toward home, not yet realizing that they had stumbled across Maplewood's darkest secret, one that had already been haunting the town for 2 sleepless nights. The missing 4-year-old, Noah Brown. That Sunday afternoon, innocence was violently punctured in Maplewood. As the story unfolded, people would say that the entire town changed in the course of that single wild hour, when 4 children, chasing a runaway ball, tripped across the blurred boundary between childhood games and irrevocable tragedy. The town of Mosby and the Brown family. Mosby, Ohio, isn't the type of place you'll find marked on tourist maps. It's a town shaped by Midwestern practicality. 2 modest grocery stores, 1 aging movie theater, and a long, tree-lined main street where everyone seems to know each other's history. Rows of single-story houses, mostly built in the 1960s, stretch behind chain-link fences, their driveways littered with basketball hoops and wagons left over from younger days. The rhythm of life flows with the opening of the local diner at 6 a.m. and the distant hum of freight trains threading past the edge of the community. The Brown family has lived in Mosby for 3 generations, a legacy woven into the community's very fabric. Michael Brown, a third-shift worker in the tool and die plant just north of town, inherited the family home from his parents. Denise, his wife, grew up in the next county but adapted quickly to Mosby's tight-knit ways, earning a reputation as a fiercely protective, warm-hearted woman who always had a kind word for neighbors but would brook no nonsense when it came to her children. Their youngest, Noah, was the center of Denise's world. The Browns had suffered heartbreak before. Their first child was lost in pregnancy years earlier, so when Noah was born on March 21, 1991, Denise was determined to guard him from every stray danger, no matter how small. Noah was the type of child who drew eyes and smiles in every grocery aisle, his shock of golden hair always in some disarray, blue eyes wide with both mischief and wonder. He moved with a toddler's energy, darting between his older sister's legs, all laughter and stubbornness bundled in a 3-foot frame. Home life was modest. The backyard was filled with secondhand toys and a weathered sandbox. Michael's job at the plant paid enough but never plenty, so Denise made every dollar count, a skill she picked up after years of moving between part-time work and full-time mothering. She made it a point to be present at every school function, and guarded Noah on outings with a nervous vigilance that bordered on obsessive to some. The family's house was never short on love, but it always bore traces of the sacrifices made to provide for 2 growing children. Weekends were for pancake breakfasts and working together in the garden. Evenings ended with Denise reading stories to Noah in the faded blue recliner by the front window, her voice drifting into his dreams long after he'd closed his eyes. To the outside world, the Browns might have seemed like any other Mosby family, solid, ordinary, anchored by routine and tradition. But for Denise, every day felt precarious, as if the world held dangers that only she could keep at bay. The fateful day. On Friday, February 12, 1993, the air in Mosby, Ohio, was laced with the chill of late winter and the usual quiet anticipation of a busy weekend. For Denise Brown, the day started out much like any other, a flurry of school drop-offs, household chores, and the mental checklist of errands that never seemed to end. With the promise of a few treats at the sprawling Plaza Mart downtown, Denise gathered her 2 children, 10-year-old Anna, responsible beyond her years, and her little brother Noah, nearly 2 and forever in motion. Their itinerary was the embodiment of small-town routine, but its ordinary nature would shatter within just a few hours. By mid-afternoon, the Plaza Mart was abuzz, its tiled floors echoing with footsteps, intercom announcements drifting above the clatter of shopping carts and the laughter of families. Denise tightly gripped Noah's mittened hand as she scanned sales on cereal and debated child-sized jackets. Anna, rolling her eyes at her boisterous brother, sometimes took charge, shepherding Noah from displays of fragile glassware and shelves lined with candy bars. Denise kept her focus. She knew all too well that a moment's distraction could spell trouble, especially with an energetic toddler in tow. In a desperate bid to keep the peace and finish her shopping in record time, Denise handed Noah a small bag of animal crackers, hoping the snack would buy 5 precious minutes of calm. As she lined up to buy a pound of ground beef at the busy butcher's counter, she allowed Noah to linger just outside the line, a few feet away but still seemingly safe within sight. Anna stood beside him, distractedly flipping through a rack of comic books, half watching her brother out of the corner of her eye. For Denise it was a calculated risk. The store was crowded, employees bustled all around, and Noah was usually obedient if occasionally mischievous. But on that day, in those few crucial moments, the Brown family's luck ran out. The butcher, flustered by a mix-up with someone's deli order, took longer than expected. Denise, glancing up every few seconds, counted on Anna's sense of responsibility, but as she received her wrapped parcel and pivoted, her mother's radar pinged. Anna was there, but Noah's blue and yellow windbreaker was nowhere in sight. What began as a routine errand descended into chaos and surreal panic. Denise's mind reeled with possibilities. Maybe Noah had wandered to the toy aisle, maybe he'd darted toward the exit in pursuit of something shiny. She calmed her voice as she asked passers-by, store staff, and eventually the uniformed security guard at the front entrance. Anna, cheeks flushed, retraced their route with trembling hands, calling her brother's name. Within minutes, the store intercom was repeating Noah's description. A little boy, almost 2, blonde hair, blue jacket, answers to Noah. And every parent in Plaza Mart tightened their grip on their own children. For Denise, the surreal fog of fear only thickened with each second that ticked by. The search, at first frantic but methodical, spread from toy aisles to loading docks and parking lots. When Noah still hadn't surfaced after 30 minutes, cold terror set in. At 4:15 p.m., Denise's trembling hands dialed 911. The voice on the line tried to reassure her, but Denise felt reality slipping, her ears ringing with an unspeakable dread as sirens grew louder in the distance, heralding the beginning of a nightmare that no one in Mosby could have imagined. The emergency search. As the chilling realization set in that little Noah was nowhere to be found, a wave of panic took hold that swept far beyond just his mother. Denise Brown's hands trembled so much she could barely grip her phone as she dialed 911 for the first time in her life. Her voice, normally calm and even-tempered, choked and cracked as she tried to articulate the nightmare forming in her mind, her toddler missing somewhere in the chaos of a crowded Ohio supermarket on a gray February afternoon. The dispatcher's questions echoed hollowly. What color jacket had Noah been wearing? Did he answer to his name? When had she last seen him, and how? Denise clawed desperately at her memory for every detail. The cheery blue and yellow windbreaker, the miniature mittens in his pocket, the cartoon bunny on his sneakers. Anna, standing beside her mother, was pale and silent, her gaze darting down aisles as if sheer willpower could conjure her brother from thin air. Within minutes, the entire staff of Plaza Mart had mobilized. Some fanned out across the toy section, others scoured the restrooms and traced the halls between automatic doors and the echoing drop-off lanes outside. The intercom crackled to life again and again, broadcasting Noah's name and description. Clerks locked eyes with passing customers, searching for a flicker of recognition. Denise called out for Noah relentlessly, her voice growing raw, holding out hope he might simply answer from behind a cereal box or beneath a display table. "Noah! Noah, honey, it's Mommy! Where are you?" By the time the first police cruiser pulled up, red and blue lights flashing against the glass facade, fear had begun to ripple through shoppers still in the store. Parents gripped their own children tighter. Rumors started to circulate. Someone had seen a little boy near the entrances. Someone else had noticed a pair of older kids moving quickly toward the parking lot. The police sprang into action, assembling a rapid response team. Lieutenant Harris took lead, coordinating with Plaza Mart security, while sending officers to canvass the area on foot and by car. The K-9 unit arrived, barking sharply as they sniffed the still cold air for any trace. Meanwhile, Denise and Anna found themselves surrounded by officers, counselors, and well-meaning store staff, all asking the same questions but never able to give the answer that mattered most. Word spread with remarkable speed. Within an hour, missing child flyers with Noah's photo, angelic, wide-eyed blonde, were being printed and taped to lampposts, tacked to bulletin boards, and handed out by volunteers, forming a human chain across parking lots and alleyways. Local radio crackled out urgent bulletins, and the evening news interrupt announced, "Search underway for missing Mosby toddler at Plaza Mart." Police locked down the supermarket, reviewing hours of security footage. Every customer leaving was gently questioned, then checked against footage by officers scanning for any pattern or unfamiliar face. Stores nearby were asked to briefly close their doors to assist. In that small-town spirit, nobody objected. Denise, overwhelmed and desperate, bounced from hope to dread with every new suggestion the search team proposed. She replayed every moment of her last encounter with Noah. Guilt gnawed at her for letting him stray even a few feet, for relying too much on Anna's watchful eye. Anna herself, normally so level-headed, was now fighting back tears, riddled with confusion and a silent self-blaming for letting the moment slip. Volunteers poured in, even PTA parents, the gas station clerk who'd once given Noah a balloon, and several high school kids in matching Mosby Mustang's Letterman jackets. Search grids were formed. Teams combed the parking lot, checked the bushes and loading docks, called out through the gray dusk as the sky darkened. There was a brief collective gasp when a toddler was spotted near a loading bay, but hope fizzled. It was not Noah. Streetlights flickered on. A cold wind picked up, carrying flyers down the gutter. Denise's phone buzzed with messages and missed calls. Her husband was on his way home from the factory, neighbors offered prayers, and family miles away promised to come help dig through every inch of Mosby. The little town, so used to routine, shifted overnight into a place ruled by search parties, prayer circles, and the relentless drone of police radios. As midnight crept closer, Denise realized that the night would bring no rest, only more waiting, more hoping, and more fear for what might come next. The first clue, and the shocks. In the early evening, as the sun dipped behind the skeletal trees of Mosby, the local police department was already buzzing with tension and activity. The disappearance of little Noah Brown had triggered a wave of dread that seemed to ripple through every phone call, every nervous glance exchanged by officers around their cluttered desks. But real progress threatened to elude them, until the first true break arrived rather unexpectedly. It all began in the cramped and fluorescent-lit security office at Plaza Mart. Technicians huddled with Detective Wallace, scrubbing through hour upon hour of grainy surveillance tape, each frame scrutinized for a glimpse of the missing toddler. While the footage from behind the cash registers showed mostly bored shoppers and disinterested clerks, patience finally paid off. At precisely 3:53 p.m., a pair of unfamiliar children could be seen leading a wobbly, fair-haired toddler in a blue and yellow jacket by the hand, weaving through the aisles and making for a side exit near the loading docks. Noah's hesitant steps, dwarfed by his companions, seemed innocent, almost staged as part of some innocent playground adventure. But to the adults in that room, The sight was chilling. No sooner had the grainy images surfaced than news of the breakthrough cascaded through the ranks. Word spread to the Browns, igniting a hope laced with fresh terror. What did it mean that two children, apparently strangers, had taken Noah out of the sprawling store? Was this a prank, a runaway, or something much darker lurking beneath the surface? Denise gripped Michael's arm until her knuckles whitened as she stared at the paused monitor, willing her son to somehow turn around and run back. Detectives moved quickly, circulating images from the footage among local schools and community centers, pressing anyone who'd seen two older boys, about 10 years old, with a much younger child in tow. Informants began trickling in, their tips ranging from vague to startlingly precise. A grandmother reported having seen 3 kids, one crying, near Westlake Park. Another local, a teenage clerk at the liquor store across from the shopping plaza, remembered a pair of kids dragging some little blonde along, looked like he didn't want to be there. Even the pizza delivery driver recalled seeing a commotion near a playground, but at the time just thought it was roughhousing. Each tip added both clarity and confusion. As timelines overlapped and locations multiplied, police were left to chase down dead-end leads and wade through a flood of emotion-charged rumors. Denise and Michael, desperate for answers, rode the emotional roller coaster, rushing to each new search site, only to have hope repeatedly dashed with every passing hour. The very idea that children were at the center of this nightmare sent shockwaves through Mosby. Parents clenched their own kids tighter, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and the notion of stranger danger warped into something unexpectedly intimate and close to home. Then, an even more disturbing piece of information surfaced. An older woman from the outer edges of town hesitantly came forward, recounting how she'd glimpsed 2 bigger boys hassling a much smaller one near the old canal bridge around dusk. She thought about intervening, but seeing no adults and unsure if it was just siblings roughhousing, she walked on. Later, her guilt would gnaw at her, as it would for so many who would replay their own fleeting sightings in their minds for weeks to come. Every community member forced to wonder, if only they'd trusted their instincts, could things have been different? That night, as images from the surveillance footage aired on the evening news and social media posts mushroomed, the entire town became invested in the case. Missing posters with Noah's cherubic face dotted storefronts and street corners, neighbors organized candlelight vigils and nightly patrols. The first true clues transformed the case, not just from a search for a lost child, but into a collective reckoning for Mosby. The community was gripped by sorrow, guilt, confusion, and above all, a rising, inescapable sense that something precious had been shattered, perhaps beyond repair. Discovering the corpse and community shock. The morning that followed was brutally cold, a Sunday that should have resembled any other, but instead, Mosby sat suspended in an anxious silence. It was the kind of day when every neighbor peeked out from behind frosted windows, wondering if the night's prayers had been enough. They hadn't been. Shortly after dawn, a railroad engineer performing routine inspections along the lonely stretch near Maplewood stumbled upon a sight that would sear itself forever into the town's collective memory. Lying awkwardly beside the tracks, just beyond a rusted old signal post and beneath a tangle of windswept trash, was the small, shrouded form of Noah Brown. The engineer's shouts echoed down the rails, quickly drawing a handful of early risers and a couple of police cruisers parked nearby. Silence overtook the onlookers as officers cordoned off the scene. Even for seasoned responders, the reality was hard to accept. Within minutes, word of the discovery trickled into every kitchen and living room in Mosby. Radios crackled with subdued urgency, police scanners bleeped incessantly, and soon a line of emergency vehicles flashed red and blue against the frost-bitten morning. Mosby's coroner, face pale with fatigue, supervised a delicate, respectful recovery of the small body as crowds formed at a careful, respectful distance. Initial reports confirmed what everyone feared. Even before the official results arrived, there was no question Noah had perished before the first freight train rumbled past that morning. Yet the state of his body shocked even the most stoic law enforcement officials. Bruises, welts, strange abrasions, and marks that had no place in a child's gentle world. Alongside were the scattered remnants of violence. A pair of bricks stained an awful, suggestive red, a battered can of blue spray paint, used batteries, and the telltale signs of crude, inexplicable suffering. When local news broke the story, the entire county fell into a stunned hush. Some parents ushered their kids indoors and locked the doors in a ritualistic attempt at safety that felt, suddenly, so fragile. For others, shock gave way to rage and incomprehension. Churches filled that Sunday not with the usual gentle hymnals but with choked sobs and hard, angry prayers. Town officials fumbled for words, their voices cracking on the radio as they begged Mosby for calm and patience. Calls poured into the sheriff's office, some offering memories, others demanding answers, all unified by disbelief. Teachers broke down in the faculty room, the memory of Noah's smile lingering painfully. The local high school's flag was lowered to half-mast by midday. Even the most practical, tough-minded farmers stopped work early, meeting neighbors with heavy hearts and little conversation, just shared, mute sorrow. The tragedy pierced through the humdrum routine of Midwest life, exposing a vulnerability no one could ignore. In the days that followed, the grisly discovery rippled outward, leaving rings of fear, confusion, and communal grief. Mosby would never look quite the same again. Local lore began to form around that stretch of railway. Old-timers would frown and shake their heads when children so much as glanced at the tracks. More than anything, a simple and devastating truth haunted parents and teachers, friends and strangers alike. The world, however routine and small it may seem, could become terrifyingly cruel in the blink of an eye. Expanded investigation and young suspects. The discovery of Noah Brown's body sent shockwaves through the small town of Mosby, bringing a somber mood that blanketed every street and household. As the news traveled and grief set in, investigators turned their focus to unraveling the grim circumstances behind Noah's last hours. Mosby's local police force, unaccustomed to handling crimes of such enormity, suddenly found itself at the center of a growing, pressure-filled investigation. Detectives, state police, and even a handful of outside experts convened in the small, wood-paneled police station. Their mission? To determine exactly what had happened, and more pressingly, who could have committed such an unspeakable act. In those first decisive days, the investigators combed through every lead. Officers canvassed neighborhoods near the tracks, retracing possible routes, knocking on doors, and asking pointed, sometimes desperate questions. They interviewed mothers in kitchens and children gathered around kitchen tables, hoping for a stray word that might open the case. The pressure was intense. Fear and anxiety prickled beneath every interaction, as neighbors eyed one another with a new wariness. It wasn't long before attention shifted to the children of the area, especially those known to play around the tracks or wander after school with few adults in sight. A breakthrough came when Mrs. Callahan, a teacher at Maplewood Elementary, called detectives after noticing two of her students, the usually exuberant Josh Miller and the more withdrawn Tyler Evans, looking unusually pale and withdrawn on the Monday after the discovery. She recounted how during recess she spotted blue paint smeared on their clothes, matching the spray paint found at the crime scene. Mrs. Callahan's careful observation and her willingness to speak up provided investigators the crucial link they needed. Josh and Tyler, both just 10 years old, were brought in for questioning, accompanied by shaken, worried parents. For the officers, the sight of two small boys in the interrogation room made the horror of the crime harder to grasp. The detectives, many of them seasoned but none familiar with interrogating children accused of brutality, felt an odd mix of dread and disbelief. The interview room, usually a space for grim-faced adults, now echoed with the rustle of too big jackets and the tap of nervous sneakered feet on linoleum floors. As questioning began, the boys grew defensive, their childhood innocence pitted against the gravity of the situation. Detectives alternated between patient coaxing and sharper inquiries. The boys' stories started to fray around the edges. Josh and Tyler nervously contradicted one another, blaming the worst parts of what happened on each other. Their youthful voices faltered, occasionally dissolving to muffled sobs, guilt-laden denials, and convoluted explanations. But as the questioning wore on, bits of truth began leaking out, a tale pieced together from half-whispered admissions, shifting blame, and the overwhelming, inescapable presence of trauma. For the police, what emerged was even harder to comprehend. The perpetrators behind Noah's death were not shadowy adults or faceless strangers, but two boys from within their own community. The news, when it finally reached Mosby's families, did not just deepen the grief. It mutated it into something more toxic and enduring, bewilderment, outrage, and a collective loss of innocence that would haunt Mosby for generations. Interwoven testimonies, fractured emotions. When the investigation reached the interrogation room, the dynamic changed from community-wide panic to the unnerving intimacy of children's voices ricocheting off stark cinder-block walls. Detective Wallace, experienced but never hardened to such young suspects, prepared himself as best he could. Every detail in the room, The box of tissues, the untouched water cups, the stack of legal pads, acquired heightened meaning. On the other side of the glass, Josh and Tyler sat apart, legs swinging anxiously off the edge of their hard plastic chairs, wrists perched on shiny tables far too broad for their small arms. Each boy was accompanied by a parent. Mrs. Miller, her makeup streaked by tears, clasped Josh's trembling hand. Tyler's stepfather, normally stern and distant, now looked as if age had pressed decades onto him overnight. The air was thick with dread, a kind of silent waiting, as if the room itself anticipated tragedy. Detectives took careful turns, sometimes soothing, sometimes stern, trying to maneuver through walls of denial, blame, and the wordless shame that comes from children forced to face unthinkable realities. Josh, usually brash and outspoken in the schoolyard, grew quiet, skin pallid, gaze focused anywhere but at the adults. Tyler fidgeted with a loose thread on his sleeve, biting his lip until it bled, shaking his head at any question that came too close to the truth. It was a painstaking, drawn-out process. At first, nothing came except fracturing denials. The detectives switched strategies, showing bits of the blue spray paint, the battered can, or Noah's yellow mitten. The boys' accounts tangled and untangled. In some moments Josh would mutter, "He just kept crying and we didn't mean," before trailing off, burying his face in his sleeve. Tyler would insist, "Josh said it was just for fun. I didn't want to." Whenever responsibility hovered near, it fluttered away to the other boy. Fatigue and guilt slowly wore them down. The initial stories of a harmless game gone wrong became stories of peer pressure, fear, and regret. Both boys broke down at intervals, Tyler sobbing so hard he hiccuped, choking out pieces of awful truth, Josh, knuckles white, whispering fragments of memory and then recoiling from his own words. The detectives tried to keep the questions gentle, but the weight of what was confessed sometimes required bluntness. It was harrowing for all. Through it all, parents were suspended between horror, protectiveness, and overwhelming grief. Mrs. Miller, biting her lips raw, tried to reach Josh, at times whispering urgent prayers. Tyler's stepfather, guilt-ridden over every missed sign, laid a hand on Tyler's back, not knowing whether it was comfort or helpless resignation. As these fractured narratives finally merged, detectives pieced together a grim timeline. No single child could shoulder all the blame, yet neither could any claim true innocence. The confessions, their stuttering cadence, the wet faces, the breathless whispers of "sorry, sorry," became a testament not only to individual culpability, but to the vast, spiraling consequences of a community's collective failure. The grown-ups in the next room, seasoned officers and exhausted parents alike, felt the room spin with each admission, each word a fresh, deep cut in the fragile lives of two children and in the heart of Mosby itself. Social turmoil and the shocking trial. The days and weeks that followed the arrests of Josh and Tyler marked a period of unprecedented upheaval for Mosby. The town that once prided itself on its predictability and neighborly trust found itself at the center of not just a legal proceeding, but a nationwide moral reckoning. Parents grew wary, school officials held emergency town hall meetings, and the dinner table conversations everywhere revolved around the same uneasy question. How had two local boys, children in the truest sense, found themselves accused of such darkness? Rumors ran wild, fueled by the relentless churn of local reporters, and soon after, regional and national news outlets. Camera crews camped outside the courthouse, searching for grieving faces and quotable moments. Talk shows picked apart the details. Psychologists and legal experts speculated endlessly about the boys' intent, their culpability, and the failures, real or perceived, of the adults meant to keep them safe. School buses rolled past protesters clutching handmade signs that called alternately for justice and mercy. Some residents lobbied for the harshest sentence possible, while others simply couldn't comprehend children being prosecuted as adults. The courthouse itself became a focal point of collective anxiety, a place where grief, anger, and confusion spilled over in sometimes ugly ways. On the morning of the trial, crowds gathered in the chilly light, some holding candles, others bracing placards. The air was tense with anticipation and grief. Journalists pressed microphones to anyone who would speak. Neighbors who had once watched the boys play in their yards, friends who'd shared snacks at recess, old-timers who shook their heads in disbelief at the very idea of children on trial for murder. Inside the courtroom, the ordinary rituals of justice took on a surreal edge. Josh and Tyler, dwarfed by the height of the defendant's table, faces pale and pinched, sat flanked by defense attorneys and trembling parents. Every witness was scrutinized, from detectives recounting the details of their investigation to experts who tried to explain, in clinical language, how such violence could erupt from such small hands. The judge, a local with a reputation for patience, now found herself forced to make decisions that would shape the national discourse on juvenile justice for years to come. Testimony was harrowing. Medical examiners, police officers, and psychologists laid out evidence and analysis, but the heart of the proceedings hovered around impossible questions. Could children truly understand the weight of their actions? Did they deserve the possibility of rehabilitation, or was the act itself unforgivable? Two silent families, one torn by unimaginable loss, the other by shame and disbelief, sat separated by mere feet but an unbridgeable gulf of pain. Every revelation reverberated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. National editorial pages channeled the shock. The trial became a lightning rod for debates over the age of criminal responsibility, the power of environment and upbringing, and the limits of collective forgiveness. Night after night, town meetings stretched late as people wrestled openly with fear, regret, and what it meant to raise children in a world capable of cruelty from the least expected sources. Roots of tragedy, family and social environment. Behind every act of inexplicable violence, especially one committed by children, there often lies a tangled web of influences. Family instability, poverty, broken trust, and lost opportunities reverberate through a young life long before tragedy erupts in the public eye. When detectives, social workers, and journalists dug into the backgrounds of Josh and Tyler, what they unearthed added layers of sorrow and uncomfortable understanding to Mosby's horror. Josh Miller's family was a classic example of quiet dysfunction. His father, out of work following a debilitating injury, oscillated between anger, depressive withdrawal, and brief efforts to reconnect with his son. Josh's mother, exhausted from juggling multiple waitressing jobs, was physically present but emotionally depleted, her patience whittled away by years of disappointment and worry over bills. The house, small, cluttered, and too often filled with shouting or cold silence, offered neither warmth nor the security that childhood demands. Arguments overheard through thin walls, doors slamming in the dead of night, and the unspoken expectation that kids must get tough or get out of the way, all left their mark on Josh. For Tyler Evans, the story was both familiar and distinct. His stepfather, a man with a short temper and a penchant for hard liquor, delivered discipline with the back of his hand more times than Tyler could count. Tyler's mother had checked out emotionally years ago, leaving her son adrift between fear and invisibility. At school, teachers noted his declining grades, strange absences, and sometimes unexplained bruises. But in a town where family business stayed private, these warning signs were chalked up to growing pains, or dismissed as rumors. Both boys found temporary escape in the world of violent movies and video games, a kind of digital theater where powerlessness disappeared for a while. Lacking real support systems or guidance, they drifted in and out of trouble, each egging the other on, seeking approval where none seemed forthcoming at home. Their social circles, already frayed at the edges, were marked by other children dealing with their own burdens: absentee parents, whispered abuse, hunger, and the numbing sameness of days spent unsupervised. As details emerged about their upbringing, the wider conversation in Mosby shifted, slowly and painfully, from horror to self-reflection. Headlines that once blared "monster children" were gradually counterbalanced by more nuanced narratives about cycles of trauma and missed opportunities for intervention. Some residents, especially those who had quietly struggled with their own family traumas, began asking the uncomfortable question, to what extent is a community responsible when its youngest members break so terribly? Few dared answer aloud, but the guilt and confusion lingered on. The tragedy of Noah Brown's death became in part a tragedy of institutional failure, a reminder that schools, social workers, friends, and neighbors too often miss or misinterpret the signs of a child slipping into crisis. It reignited old debates about access to mental health services, the stigma surrounding family violence, and the scarcity of safe spaces for children after school. In meetings at the town hall and in sermons on Sunday mornings, the question became not just what punishment the boys deserved, but how Mosby might better protect the next generation from the invisible wounds that sometimes manifest in disaster. This undercurrent of introspection didn't erase the heartbreak or outrage, but it did force Mosby, and in time, a watching nation, to look past the lurid headlines and into the homes, schools, and neighborhoods where so many struggles remain hidden in plain sight. lasting consequences and psychological trauma. The aftermath of the Noah Brown case reverberated across Mosby and far beyond, radiating waves of grief, anxiety, and a persistent, inescapable sense of loss that seemed to settle deep in the collective psyche. For the Brown family, there was never any real closure. Noah's absence echoed in every silent morning, every empty seat at the dinner table, and in the birthdays celebrated with a new kind of solemnity. Denise Brown, once known for her warmth and expressive laughter, retreated inward, her days blurred by sorrow, plagued by relentless self-interrogation and guilt. Michael, hardened by tragedy, became even more distant, casting a long shadow over the remnants of their home life. Anna, Noah's sister, grew quiet, her childhood innocence stripped away, replaced by a premature, heavy-eyed vigilance. With time, the immediate furor faded, but the deeper wounds lingered, evolving into chronic wounds that colored every aspect of life. Children walked more carefully to school, parents rehearsed safety lectures with nervous urgency, and there was an unspoken agreement that nothing in Mosby was ever truly safe anymore. Shops installed extra cameras, teachers became hyper-vigilant at recess, even local churches found their congregations divided, not by faith, but by an undercurrent of suspicion and unresolved grief. Outside the Brown family, those involved directly in the investigation or aftermath carried their own burdens. Police officers who once greeted one another cheerfully now spoke with a gravity reserved for war veterans. The school counselors struggled with a surge of students expressing anxiety, trouble concentrating, and fear of abandonment. At the same time, the wider Mosby community, normally close-knit, began to fracture along new fault lines. Parents who blamed one another for failings real or imagined, old friendships that couldn't withstand the strain, and newcomers who eyed their neighbors with wary skepticism. The media, never far from the story, ensured that the tragedy's aftershock spread far beyond the town. News specials revisited Mosby on anniversaries, while national debates around child violence, juvenile justice, and community accountability frequently cited Noah's case as a cautionary tale. Old newspaper clippings and television reports became recurring sources of pain for the Browns and, over the years, drew a mix of sympathy and unwanted scrutiny every time the story resurfaced. The digital footprint lingered. Online forums, podcasts, and true crime documentaries kept the wounds open, preventing the small community from ever fading back into true anonymity. For some families, the trauma hardened into generational anxiety. Parents developed an almost ritualistic approach to safety. Elaborate plans for after-school pickups, coded phone calls, the barring of unsupervised play. Children grew up haunted by warnings and cautionary tales, their first lessons about trust colored by the loss of someone their own age. Simple joys, sleepovers, unsupervised walks, trips to the park, acquired a new air of risk, and some friendships dissolved altogether under the weight of mutual fear. Within Mosby's institutions, the tragedy became an unofficial curriculum. Teachers referenced the case when discussing empathy, bullying, or personal responsibility, but even these efforts sparked debate. How much was protective, and at what point did remembrance simply begin to re-traumatize those closest to the horror? School assemblies and community forums wrestled over the right balance between commemoration and the right to move on, leaving many caught in a cycle of reliving the trauma with each new school year. The boys at the center of the tragedy, having served their sentences and emerged into adulthood under new identities, were never truly free of the past. Though legally given a chance at rehabilitation and privacy, the specter of their childhood crime followed them, a burden they could not fully cast off even with counseling, legal anonymity, or attempted relocation. Some in Mosby felt justice had been served, while others remained bitter, convinced that neither time nor name change orders could truly absolve or protect them from their actions or the community's memory. Therapists and mental health professionals in the region saw a notable uptick in consultations for post-traumatic stress, grief, and anxiety, problems that didn't fade with the headlines. Over time, Mosby became a case study not only in legal or psychological circles but in every field contemplating the ripple effects of trauma. Clergy offered new sermons on pain and redemption, social workers advocated for better early intervention, and parent groups redefined notions of vigilance and forgiveness. What perhaps lingered the longest, however, was not the memory of the crime itself but the persistent question of what might have been done differently. Every parent who left for work, every teacher on playground duty, every police officer driving the early morning circuit bore an extra invisible burden, a determination to be more watchful, a fear of missing the next warning sign, and though headlines and rumors would eventually fade, The undercurrent of sadness and vigilance, a changed sense of safety, would endure for generations, forever twining Noah Brown's story with the living memory of Mosby. The tragedy does not close. The story of Noah Brown's death continued to echo through Mosby and far beyond, resisting the neat closure everyone desperately craved. Even years later, as the headlines faded and those directly involved tried to move forward with their fractured lives, the tragedy lingered with the weight and permanence of a scar. In the silence after court decisions and the return of daily routines, the unanswerable questions about innocence, punishment, forgiveness, and fate remained, gnawing at the collective conscience. The echoes of that dark February week reframed how parents watched over their children, how teachers read warning signs, and how neighbors looked at one another. Mosby found itself the subject of sociological studies, true crime documentaries, and hushed conversations at family gatherings, a cautionary tale that refused to recede into the past. For some, the events blurred into a kind of myth, retold in nervous whispers as children grew up warned not to wander too far after dark, not to trust strangers, and sometimes, not even to trust friends. The Brown family never returned to anything anyone could call normal. Denise and Michael, subjected to waves of grief and guilt, moved away within a year, seeking anonymity but never quite finding peace. Anna, who was only 10 when she lost her brother, spent adolescence in the shadow of tragedy, wrestling with nightmares and the impossible expectation to move on. Their new lives were haunted by old headlines, the flash of blue and yellow jackets, the numbing chill of February, echoes of sirens and the sound of their own pleading in hallways now thousands of miles away. For the families of Josh and Tyler, the repercussions were equally unending. Even after names were changed and records sealed following their release, whispers shadowed every attempt at fresh starts. Small towns have long memories, and though some voices called for mercy, others demanded justice with a bitterness that outlasted the boys' sentences. The question of whether redemption was possible for children who had committed violence as children, and what role the community played in their futures, remained uncomfortably unresolved. In Mosby, memorials scattered across the town became sites of perpetual mourning and debate. Year after year, on the anniversary of Noah's disappearance, candles appeared at the edge of the old railway tracks, sometimes left by those who had never even met him but knew the story by heart. The makeshift memorial grew into something larger, a silent gathering ground for all the grief, anger, and confusion that refused to settle. Each flicker of light was both a lament for young lives destroyed and a protest against a world that could allow such tragedy. The town struggled with how to teach its children about the past. Some schools quietly removed all mention of the case from their history lessons, afraid that reopening wounds would do more harm than good. Others tried to use the tragedy as a springboard for conversations about empathy, community responsibility, and the dangers of brushed-aside suffering. Yet, with every earnest attempt at healing, old wounds threatened to reopen, reminders that time could not so easily mend what had been torn open. Media attention never completely left Mosby. Journalists and filmmakers would occasionally return, cameras in tow, seeking new angles on the Maplewood tragedy. Some saw these projects as exploitative, a reopening of pain for public consumption, while others hoped that continued discussion might prevent future loss elsewhere. The community remained divided, those who wanted to forget, those who demanded remembrance, and those simply too tired to care anymore. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the layer of fear and doubt that settled over Mosby and, for a time, over the country. National conversations flared up about child safety, the failings of social systems, and the limits of forgiveness and punishment for young offenders. Opinion pieces and cable news debates swirled around the Mosby case, as it came to be called shorthand, and laws concerning juvenile justice shifted in its wake, but never in ways that were clean or satisfying to all sides. Parents, meanwhile, worried over how much protection was too much and how much freedom was too dangerous. Friendships between families were tested by suspicion and silence. Nobody could agree where responsibility truly lay, on parents, schools, the police, society, or some monstrous twist of fate. This confusion became cyclical. As each generation grew up, the tragedy receded into local lore but never vanished, resurfacing in anxieties whispered at playground fences or in the caution-laden glances parents gave as children played beyond their sight. Ultimately, the tragedy of Noah Brown would never have a satisfying ending. The questions it raised about childhood innocence, communal guardianship, and the potential for redemption or damnation in even the youngest hearts would always hover just out of reach. In this way, the story became more than a crime to solve or a wound to close. It was a bruise that refused to fade, pulsing with the knowledge that beneath the surface of everyday life, darkness could still thrive, uncontained by verdicts or the passing of years.